Good day, everyone. Welcome back to a series of video presentations in which we will now try to discuss the third part, or let's say the third chapter of your research paper, which pertains to your methodology. And this methodology is the one that you will be writing right after you accomplish the chapter 2 of your research paper, which is the RRLS. Okay, now after writing the second chapter of your research paper, which ends with a one paragraph synthesis, okay, take note, class, that the second chapter or the chapter 2 of your research paper ends with a one paragraph synthesis. Okay, so right after you have written your one paragraph synthesis, we will now be having our transition, okay, from chapter 2 to your chapter 3, which is the methodology. Okay? So, right after your synthesis, you will be now writing the part of your research paper where you will reveal your research design. Okay? So, the transition between chapter 2 and chapter 3, okay, will start with the revelation of your research design. Okay, as well as the summary, okay, summary of the processes of how you will conduct the study. Okay, again, the transition between chapter 2 and chapter 3 will start with the revelation of the research design, as well as the illumination of the summary of the processes involved in the conduct of your study. Okay, and it will look like this. Okay, okay, it will look like this. So this part of your paper is known as the conceptual framework. Okay, this is known as the conceptual framework. So the conceptual framework is also known as the research framework. Okay, or it is also known as the research paradigm. Okay, this is known as the research paradigm. So the research paradigm, class, is the part of your research paper where you will indicate the summary of information of your research design, of your research design, okay, as well as your methodology. Okay, again, the research paradigm is the part of the research paper where you will indicate the summary of the information of your research design, as well as the summary of information of your methodology. And it uses a format known as the IPO. So, what is the IPO format? IPO stands for input, process, and output. Output. Okay, so the research paradigm summarizes the methodology and research design using the input, process, output format. Okay, so how do we write this part of the research paper? So here are some guidelines in writing the research framework or the research paradigm. So let us have the following. So for our first guideline, let's try to look at this part. Okay, so this part is actually the umbrella title, is actually the umbrella title of your IPO framework. So whenever we say umbrella title, it is, let's say, the general identification of your framework. And how do you name, or let's say, how do you put the title of your framework? Okay, so in order for you to identify, or let's say, in order for you to give a title for IPO framework, you simply have to identify your research design. Okay, you simply have to identify your research design. So for this example, we have experimental design and thematic analysis framework. Okay, so here we titled the research framework according to the research design. So that will be our first guideline. Okay, create the title of your framework with the help of your research design. Now, you might wonder, what is the research design of your SIP? Okay, so you might wonder, what is the research design of our SIP? So let's try to answer this question. So your SIP class, it actually uses an experimental research design. Okay, again, your SIP actually uses an experimental research design. So if your SIP uses an experimental research design, your umbrella title for your research framework will be Experimental Design Framework. Okay? So the title you will put here is Experimental Design Framework. Okay, now you might wonder, why is it that your SIPs are considered to be experimental? Or let's say, why is it that your SIPs use experimental research design? What is the basis? Okay, what is the basis? Why is it that your SIP uses an experimental research design? Okay, so note class that your SIP have specific objectives known as the comparative research questions. Okay, so we have this objective to test the significant difference between two or more groups in terms of measurable variables. And this specific objective is an example of a comparative research question. Okay, so having, let's say, a research that uses comparative research question has a high chance that it uses an experimental research design. So that is the first criteria, okay, of an experimental research design. It must use a comparative research question in their specific objectives. Okay, next, notice this let's say, phrase. So we have two or more groups. Okay. So what are those groups that we are needed? Let's say that we are needed to compare. Okay. So class, we have what we call the experimental group. Okay. We have experimental group, and we also have what we call the controlled group. Okay, so these are actually the groups being compared in a specific study. We have the experimental group and we have the control group. Now, what is the difference between the two groups? Okay, so in the experimental group, okay, the experimental group is the group you will be using in your experimental setup that utilizes the independent variable. Okay, always remember that the experimental group is the one that uses the independent variable. So it is the group that will receive the experimental treatment of your independent variable. So that will be the experimental group. Okay, experimental group uses the independent variable. Now, how about the control groups? So the control groups, it actually, let's say, it actually pertains to the usual thing. Okay? It actually pertains to the usual thing. Whenever we say usual thing, it is, let's say, the normal activity, or let's say the pre-existing custom, the normal practice that is applied to our experimental unit. Okay? Whenever we say control group, it is the usual thing or usual practice applied to the experimental unit. And the control group is actually divided into two. We have the positive control and we have the negative control. So what is the difference between the positive control and the negative control? Okay, whenever we say positive controlled group, it is the usual thing we apply to the experimental unit that has an effect. Okay? It inflicts an effect on the dependent variable or measurable variable of the IV. Okay? So oftentimes, the positive control group are actually the commercial brands. Okay? these are the pre-existing products per se, the commercial brands. Okay, now the negative control group, on the other hand, is the usual thing we apply that doesn't exhibit any effect. So it has no effect. So, contrary to the positive control group, the negative control group has no effect on the dependent variable or measurable variable of the IV. Okay, so that will be the difference. So those are the common factors that can distinguish an experimental research design. So again, in order for us to distinguish that a certain research uses an experimental research design is that number one, it uses a comparative research question, and number two, it consists, or let's say it aims to, let's say, compare the controlled and the experimental group. And one more thing, oftentimes experimental researches produce a product. Okay, they produce a product. So these are the common, let's say, criteria so that we can say that our research uses an experimental research design. Okay, so for our next video presentation, we will now be discussing the other guidelines on how to write your conceptual framework.